Our missiles will speak for themselves. That's the 5-word message Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky launched at Vladimir Putin back in November, and it wasn't a warning. It was a promise, a threat, a declaration that Russia is no longer safe even behind its own borders. For almost 3 years, Putin's forces had hammered Ukraine from a distance, launching missiles, drones and artillery from Russian soil, knowing Ukraine couldn't fire back. But that game was over. Backed by the West and armed with precision long-range weapons, Ukraine was finally able to strike back at Russian territory, and they weren't bluffing. Military bases, ammunition depots, airfields, convoys, all of them were within firing range and within reach. And leading this phase of the war was none other than Ukraine's most powerful weapon, the US-made MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile System, better known as ATACMS. Let's break down what this battlefield game-changer can actually do and why it has Putin sweating bullets. These are US-made missiles designed and manufactured first by Ling Temco Vought and later by Lockheed Martin. They were first made back in the 1980s, at a time when Cold War doctrines were shifting and the US needed a conventionally armed, long-range, tactical ballistic missile to potentially strike enemy reserves at a distance. They've since been in use in several conflicts, including the Gulf War and the Iraq War. ATACMS measure up at 13 feet in length and 24 inches in diameter. They use solid propellant and can be configured with 2 different types of warheads. The first is a cluster bomb, made up of hundreds of small bomblets that burst and explode across a wide area, perfect for wiping out multiple light armored units like parked aircraft, air defense systems, transport vehicles, or battalions of troops. The second features a single warhead, weighing in at around 500 pounds, with enough firepower to destroy large buildings, structures, and reinforced facilities. In short, with these missiles, Ukraine can target almost anything, from Russian vehicles to bases and battalions, and it doesn't matter if the targets are far away, as the ATACMS' biggest advantage is its range. These missiles can fly up to 190 miles in total, and that was a major boost for Ukraine. Without long-range missiles like the ATACMS in its arsenal, Ukraine would usually only be able to strike about 70 to 75 miles into Russia with its older Tochka-U missiles. While systems like the Neptune missile offer longer reach, they are primarily naval weapons and not suited for widespread ground strikes. That's where ATACMS changes the game. With a range of up to 190 miles, so many new viable targets come into view. If we look at maps of the border area, we can see that at least 14 Russian air bases are now within reach. So should Ukraine choose to strike Russian soil, it has more options than ever, thanks entirely to the American ATACMS. And range isn't the only advantage. When fired either from a tracked M270 multiple launch rocket system, an MLRS, or wheeled M142 high mobility artillery rocket system, or HIMARS, ATACMS follow a ballistic path upwards into the atmosphere, before then dropping down back to Earth at speeds of up to Mach 3, which is 3 times the speed of sound, or around 2,300 miles an hour. Because they're so fast and move at such high angles, they're really hard to intercept. That makes them much more likely to strike their targets successfully, rather than being shot out of the air by Russian air defenses. And given that each missile costs around $1.5 million to make, it's very important that they hit their targets, rather than being wasted. For a long time, Ukraine had possession of ATACMS, but didn't actually have permission to use them for long-range strikes within Russia. However, that situation evolved. Ukraine received approval, and as Zelensky says, the missiles speak for themselves when they start hitting Russian targets in places like the Kursk Oblast. The only downside is that Ukraine doesn't have any more of these missiles to work with at the moment. Reports suggest that it received around 40. Fortunately, the ATACMS aren't the only missiles in the Ukrainian arsenal. It also received Storm Shadow missiles from 2 of its leading European allies, the UK and France. Also known as Scalp EG missiles, Storm Shadows are a Franco-British invention. Low observable and long range, they are based on the French-made Apache anti-runway cruise missiles but carry singular warheads rather than cluster bombs. The Storm Shadows have a maximum range of around 155 miles or 250 kilometers. Each one costs around $1 million and is fired from planes rather than ground-based systems. Once launched, the missile can reach top speeds of more than 600 miles per hour, which is around Mach 0.8. Not quite the speed of sound, but close to it. They fly low to the ground to avoid detection on enemy radar systems, cleverly using GPS and terrain-matching technologies to stealthily approach their targets. The missiles also have cameras fitted to the nose to confirm target identities just before striking. Since each one is so expensive, nearly $1 million, it's important for them to not be wasted, just like the ATACMS. That's why each launch is often planned with great care, and swarms of cheap drones are sometimes sent ahead of the Storm Shadow missiles, confusing and exhausting the enemy's air defense systems before the missile enters the field of combat. For a time, as with the ATACMS, Ukraine's European allies forbade it from using Storm Shadows deep in Russian territory. However, that policy shifted and relaxed, with Ukraine using Storm Shadows against long-range Russian targets for the first time in late 2024. The missiles have proven highly effective too. They've struck Black Sea Naval Headquarters in Sevastopol, as well as making the entire region of Crimea unsafe for Russia's navy. Justin Crump, former British Army officer and experienced military analyst, explains, "It's no surprise that Kyiv has lobbied for its use inside Russia, particularly to target airfields being used to mount the glide bomb attack that have recently hindered Ukrainian frontline efforts. Now, given the green light to use these missiles as needed, Ukraine enjoys much stronger offensive capabilities. It can use the Storm Shadows to defend the small pieces of Russian ground it can capture, as well as targeting airfields and logistics hubs deep beyond the international border." Indeed, one study from the Institute for the Study of War think tank suggests that around 225 Russian bases are within striking range of Storm Shadows fired from Ukrainian soil. And even though Russia has taken precautionary measures, moving jets and other expensive, important equipment further back into its territory, there's still a multitude of targets for Ukraine to look at and plenty of potential damage to be done. Again, there's a caveat here. The UK and France can't supply too many of these missiles, as there aren't actually that many available to give. Because of that, Ukraine cannot rely solely on missiles provided by its allies. It has to produce its own as well. Fortunately, it's got some excellent options in the ranks, like the R-360 Neptune. The Neptune has an interesting story behind it. It was first unveiled at the 2015 Arms and Security International Exhibition in Kyiv, entering service in 2021, and it was designed originally as an anti-ship missile, only to be used at sea for destroying the likes of warships and transport vessels. Its design was inspired by the older Soviet Kh-35 subsonic anti-ship missile, but the Neptune brings big improvements over its predecessor in terms of range and targeting capabilities. It has a maximum range of around 200 to 250 miles and is equipped with a 330-pound warhead and a Motor-Sich MS-400 engine, helping it reach peak subsonic speeds of around 550 miles per hour. In the early days of the Russian invasion, Ukraine used the Neptune to great effect against Russia's naval fleet. It was most famously used to help sink the Russian flagship cruiser, the Moskva, in 2022, with 2 successive Neptune strikes sending the ship down. Neptunes were also used against numerous other Russian vessels, and experts within the Ukrainian military started to wonder, what if we could use this same missile on land? So they got to work developing a ground-based version. Fitted with a new guidance system to help it strike ground targets with precision and efficiency, the ground-based all-weather subsonic Neptune entered use in 2023. Since then, there have been numerous documented cases of successful Neptune strikes on Russian targets. On May 31, 2024, for example, Neptune missile strikes targeted a ferry crossing and oil terminal at the port of Kavkaz, around 155 miles from the front line. Huge damage was inflicted on the terminal and 2 ferries. On June 21, 2024, a Russian drone base storing Shahid-type UAV devices near Yeysk was targeted, with widespread destruction of drone storage and preparation facilities, as well as control points and training buildings. A month later, in July 2024, more Neptunes successfully hit another Russian ferry at the port of Kavkaz, which was supplying Russian troops in Crimea and other occupied territories, and military warehouses near Kursk used for storing aviation weapons and equipment. Another month later in August, another Russian ferry sank after being hit with Ukrainian Neptune missiles, and the attacks have continued into 2025, with a successful warehouse strike in the Russian Rostov region in January of this year. This just goes to show how effective the Neptunes have turned out to be, and how Ukraine is also able to stand up and fight with its own high-end weapons, not just those supplied by its allies. And the transformation of the Neptune missile from a purely sea-based weapon to one that can work so effectively on land is an amazing example of Ukraine's innovation, resilience, and ability to adapt in the face of extreme hardship. But Ukraine isn't stopping there. Under constant threat of further Russian aggression, this resilient country continues to research, develop, and invest in new military innovations, including missiles that can hit harder, travel further, and strike deeper into enemy territory. Earlier this year, President Zelensky announced that the country had tested and operationally used an upgraded version of its Neptune cruise missile, a version that could change the tide of the war should it be developed in bigger quantities and deployed in the field. This new and improved Neptune is named the Long Neptune, so called because of its massive range. While the Neptune can theoretically hit targets up to 250 miles away, the Long Neptune goes further, much further. It can strike targets at distances of a whopping 1,000 kilometers or 621 miles. On Telegram, Zelensky said, "The Long Neptune has been tested and successfully used in combat, a new Ukrainian missile, an accurate strike. Its range is 1,000 kilometers. I am grateful to our Ukrainian developers, manufacturers and military. We continue to work to ensure Ukraine's security. The Long Neptune is the result of years of effort. We've already spoken about how the original Neptune missiles were exclusively used at sea before being adapted for land-based attack roles in 2023. Ukraine has continued to improve this missile, extending its range and utility, and as Zelensky confirmed, the Long Neptune has already been used to strike a Russian target. It was launched on March 14, 2025, striking a Russian oil refinery in the town of Tuapse, which is around 300 miles from the front lines. In larger quantities, Long Neptunes could significantly bolster Ukraine's offensive capabilities. Mykola Sunharovsky of the Razumkov Center, a Ukrainian public policy NGO based in Kyiv, says that the only issue is whether or not Ukraine can actually ramp up production of these missiles in time. I hope that with a combination of technological, manufacturing, and financial resources, Ukraine and its Western partners can really crank up production. However, Sunharovsky also expressed concern about where Ukraine could produce the missiles, since its entire territory is effectively under attack. Another expert, Serhiy Zagurets of the Ukrainian defense consultancy Defense Express, agrees that mass production is important if Ukraine wants to make the most of these missiles, suggesting that the country needs to make around 40 to 50 missiles monthly to maintain pace with Russia. On the Russian side, news of the Long Neptune has clearly had an effect. The country has relocated possible targets like valuable fighter jets further back from the front lines, so they can't be targeted at this time. But as Sunharovsky puts it, Russia might be able to move jets and vehicles, but you can't move an oil refinery. The Long Neptunes, together with other long-range missiles Ukraine has, give the country the power to strike so many more targets. They always could strike targets at range with drones like the Lyuchi and Ninja that can travel hundreds of miles to their destination, but drones are limited in terms of the actual damage they can do, especially to reinforced targets and structures. As Oleksiy Hetman, reserve major of the Ukrainian National Guard, explains, drones will still be used, but they can't carry much of an explosive charge, up to 50 kilos. You cannot penetrate a fortified target with them, not even if you hit it with several drones at once. Missiles, however, are much more potent and devastating. With their huge warheads, they can absolutely destroy fortified Russian targets, which could include logistics centers, manufacturing facilities, refineries, and barracks. And Ukraine's ambitious missile innovation does not end with Long Neptunes. The country is also hard at work on another big missile program known under the names RIM-2, Grom, and OTRK Sapsan. RIM translates to thunder in English, and the RIM-2 missiles are set to be extremely sophisticated and destructive, fusing the features of tactical missile systems and multiple rocket launchers in one short-range ballistic missile package. Ukraine has been working on this project for quite some time, starting in 2006, but has recently made some big strides. On August 27, 2024, at the Ukraine 2024 Independence Forum, President Zelensky announced the first successful tests of the RIM-2 missiles, marking a huge step forward for the long-running project. A couple of months later, in October, Yehor Cherniev, head of the permanent Ukrainian delegation to NATO, said of the RIM-2 missiles, "Here, believe me, there will soon be concrete results that not only Ukraine, but the Russian Federation will see." However, details around the missiles and their capacities are still quite scarce. Reports suggest that they will have a maximum range of 700 kilometers or 435 miles, making them some of the most far-reaching missiles in the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces. The RIM-2 missiles are also said to be highly versatile, capable of multiple warhead configurations and launchable from a range of mobile platforms, giving Ukraine numerous options in terms of how and where it uses these weapons and which types of targets it strikes. Theoretically, the RIM-2s could be used in both offensive and defensive capacities, targeting anything from supply routes to command centers, production facilities, and more. It's going to take time for Ukraine to produce these missiles in sufficient quantities, especially as it comes under near constant fire all across its territory. But once again, if production can be accelerated enough, these missiles would give the country a real advantage. One of the advantages for Ukraine about making its own missiles like RIM-2s is that it doesn't have to wait for other countries to approve their usage or set rules about which locations and structures can be targeted, which has been the case in the past with the likes of Storm Shadows and ATACMS. With RIM-2s and Neptunes, Ukraine is free to use its own missiles exactly as it sees fit. And we haven't even spoken about the numerous other missiles and missile systems in Ukraine right now. The country also has a good supply of Tochka-U missiles, dating back to the Soviet times. It had around 90 of these when the invasion began, but has since been able to produce more of its own to replenish the supply. Then there are all the missile-based air defense systems Ukraine can call on. It has the American MGM-140 Patriot surface-to-air missile or SAM system, for example, which has been used in many conflicts across the years like the Gulf War, Iraq War, and Syrian Civil War. Ukraine is set to have around 10 of these systems in total, and they're some of the most effective weapons in terms of defending ground structures and infrastructure by taking out aerial threats like jets, drones, and cruise missiles. Ukraine also has the NASAMS, the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, to defend its airspace, along with the state-of-the-art German IRIS-T SLM and SLS systems, which boast incredible success rates and help to stop Russian drone and missile attacks regularly, saving lives and protecting vital infrastructure. With strong missile defenses already in place and increasingly potent offensive missile capacities too, Ukraine's strength is building, and if Zelensky's words are anything to go by, the country is ready to up its offensive game and strike back at Putin's forces. If it makes the right moves and can keep a steady supply of new missiles rolling out to its ground and aerial forces, there's no telling how much damage it can do to enemy bases and infrastructure. It could even be enough to turn the tide of the war once and for all. What do you think? Could missiles like the RIM-2s and Long Neptunes give Ukraine the edge it needs to win the war? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching.